In an interview published in 2022, the same day that Elden Ring was released, director Hidetaka Miyazaki said, "I've never been a very skilled player. I die a lot. So in my work, I want to answer the question, if death is to be more than a mark of failure, how do I give it meaning? How do I make death enjoyable?" There's a straightforward answer to this question that goes something like, there's a joy in overcoming struggle. And of course, that's true. But each player's unique experience of death and rebirth, of struggling and overcoming, is intermingled with and reflected in the mythos of the world. And so the joy is not just in overcoming struggle, but in finding meaning in the struggle. And that meaning becomes universal. It transcends the world of Elden Ring and applies to all aspects of life.
You are certainly brave, but I believe you purposefully put your life in danger and seek the meaning of your existence by battling to preserve it.
There are two incantations that overtly refer to meaning and provide a pathway into the overall structure of the world: the law of regression and the law of causality. Regression is the pull of meaning that all things yearn eternally to converge, and the incantation itself heals all negative statuses, dispels special effects, and reveals mimicry in all its forms. Most importantly, this incantation dispels the illusion that Marika and Radagon are two separate people. But what exactly does meaning and convergence represent here? On the one hand, it could be referring to a force like entropy, the tendency for all order to tend toward disorder, for all life to break down into its component parts and converge in what Darwin called the primordial soup, and what the lore of Elden Ring calls the Crucible. Aspects of the Crucible reads, "This is a manifestation of the Erd Tree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial crucible, where all life was once blended together." This yearning for convergence is most clearly manifested in the frenzied flame, which can be used to melt all life, including eternal spirits, and make it one again. Hayata, a follower of the frenzied flame, tells us,
"All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again."
It's unclear whether the Crucible and the One Great are two names for the same thing, but it is clear that they both represent a similar concept: life as one homogeneous whole without differentiation. And so this desire to melt it all away until all is one again is the most overt example of this eternal yearning to converge that the law of regression refers to. But this yearning to converge could also take the form of giving up one's individuality in order to become a part of a larger order. Or it could take the form of yearning for death, like Teolie.
"Let me be. I won't be long."
Or it could take the form of enslaving or killing others, uniting them with your order against their will. We, for instance, as the Tarnished, gain strength by murdering lots and lots of other creatures, uniting their lives within ourselves in the form of runes. And runes, as the item description says, are still imbued with the power of life itself. And so, the law of regression alone would result in all differences collapsing into a single one. It would result in destroying individuality and difference in favor of a single giant rune, I guess you might say. And so there's a second law that's in opposition to the law of regression, the law of causality, where causality is defined as the pull between meanings, that which links all things in a chain of relation. And so, in order to retain individuality and order, different forms of life must be united through a chain of relations, instead of through convergence. I think this is why the Elden Ring is able to be united, even though it's made up of distinct great runes. As we can see from the runes we gather in the game, they're usually a homogeneous orb that begins to resemble an eye as they grow larger. Individual runes are, to use the metaphor that's clearly implied, like individual symbols of a language that by themselves mean nothing, but when strung together, create meaning. The Elden Ring, for instance, is made up of runes of various shapes and sizes, and can be altered by adding or removing runes. And so, the depiction of the Elden Ring at Farum Azula, presumably the Elden Ring of the Ancient Dragons, contains a different configuration of runes than the Elden Ring of the Golden Order. Interestingly, the law of causality incantation manifests a small ring of causality within that allows the caster to automatically retaliate upon receiving a certain number of blows. I interpret this small ring of causality to be a sort of copy of the Elden Ring that manifests in an individual and allows them to act as if they are an embodiment of the Golden Order. In other words, by uniting meanings through a chain of relations, the player character creates a microcosm of the Order within themselves, and that model of the whole automatically retaliates against opposition by destroying differences external to it. And so this chain of relations between distinct forms of life is what I believe is meant by an order, like the Golden Order, with the Elden Ring being a representation of that order. And in the lands between, a representation of a thing is a conduit for the power contained in the thing itself. And so, like all great mythologies, Elden Ring can be understood through analogy, not just in the sense that something is like something else, but that the parts are microcosms of the whole, so that if you understand a part, you therefore understand something about the whole. In the Hebrew Bible, when God creates man in his own image, that makes man a microcosm of God, presumably because we also can dream of new worlds and create them. But unlike in monotheistic religions, where God is viewed as an overflowing source of life, Elden Ring flips that structure on its head. The source of life emerges from the land, and the order imposed by the greater will acts as a sort of funnel, sucking the life force out of the many. This method of understanding the world through microcosmic analogy was developed in the writings of Plato. In Plato's Republic, for instance, Socrates and the other characters of the dialogue try to describe the best way to order one's soul, that is, the best way to live one's life. But it's too difficult to understand the human soul, so instead they try to describe the ideal order for a city, in the hopes that they can transpose that order onto the individual. For the sake of this video, it doesn't matter how Socrates ordered that city, but rather the belief that there is an eternal, unchanging model telling us how things ought to be ordered. And so, toward the end of the dialogue, once the ideal city has been described, it's clarified that this city doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. But in heaven, perhaps, a pattern is laid up for the man who wants to see and found a city within himself on the basis of what he sees. It doesn't make any difference whether it is or will be somewhere, for he would mind the things of this city alone and of no other. About 5 centuries later, the authors of the Christian Gospels, clearly influenced by Neoplatonic thought, would write about being reborn as citizens of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is within you. Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a net that was cast into the sea, and gathered of every kind, which, when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down, and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth, and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so the idea of this eternal city lingered and evolved, and a millennium later, after Christianity was established in Rome and had therefore spread throughout Europe, European Christians united against the non-Christian world and embarked on a series of crusades, with the goal of taking back the Holy Lands from the infidels and establishing the kingdom of God on earth. A kingdom meant to only exist as an ideal representation of order was brought to earth. You can probably see where I'm going with this. It is said that long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would later become the Elden Ring. It was the vassal beast of the Greater Will, and the living incarnation of the concept of order. And so the Elden Ring represents an ideal order brought down to the lands between from the heavens, and the results were anything but ideal. Gold is a soft, heavy metal whose value in the real world is primarily that of representation, and more recently is used in electronics because it's a good conductor of electricity. But in and of itself, it has very little practical uses, especially in past societies. As coinage or jewelry or statues, it can carry an agreed upon value and meaning within a society. But as a tool or building material, it's far too soft and heavy to be of any real use. But despite its uselessness, a society's faith in the exchange value of gold makes it the most valuable material, a stand-in for anything a person might desire. And most importantly, this faith in the value of gold creates a somewhat arbitrary distinction between those who possess gold and those who do not. And so, because gold easily becomes an object of representation, and because representation in the lands between manifests the power of the represented object, gold becomes a stand-in for life itself, and those outside of the golden order must be subjugated and destroyed. They are the antithesis, the shadow. By becoming a representation of life itself, anyone opposed to the golden order is opposed to life.
I wish to be a mother to those who live in death. So it is that any loathing, any hatred that overshadows them, I must bear as a matter of duty with my own flesh.
Ironically, however, those living with grace seem to be under a similar curse, stuck in a stagnated life and unable to die. And so these contradictory laws of regression and causality meet in the soul of every being, tormenting them with opposing desires. The desire to end the suffering and return to a state of oneness with life, and the opposing desire to preserve the chain of relations that make up the golden order. The most clear instance of this suffering can be seen in the abyssal woods in the Land of Shadow, where the frenzied flame literally flows through the waters and seeps from the rocks. Even here, the power of gold suppresses, as is symbolized in Midra, whose infliction with the frenzied flame is suppressed by the impalement of a golden torture device. Unwilling to destroy life, he must eternally endure the agonizing pain of the golden barbs within him.
Enough. I have endured more than enough.
The remembrance of Midra reads, as the golden barbs inflicted eternal agony upon him, Midra held fast to Anaya's entreaty. Endure. The word was a curse.
I ask you forgive me, dearest Anaya.
When he removes this blade from his skull, the barbs wind gently around the blade and become the great sword of damnation. And the skill on that great sword is the golden crux, whose description reads, there is something of the golden order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux, which I take to mean the impaling of a person through the top of the head with this golden barbed torture device resembles the way in which the golden order rules the lands between. In other words, after this ideal representation of order fell to earth, it subjugated and suppressed life in all its forms, even the very person who embodies that ideal. And Radagon, after being defeated by the player character, becomes a literal tool to that order, a sword that takes on a similar spiral shape to the Great Sword of Damnation. But what exactly is happening on a cosmic level in the lands between? There's the Golden Order and the Elden Ring and the Erd Tree, and they are all representations of this eternal model. But there's also a greater will and outer gods and warring factions, and the ability to die and be reborn an endless number of times. And the Golden Order claims to represent all of this, but in reality only represents a small part. Everything else is represented as shadows of the true order, as lesser copies of the real thing. Plato has another dialogue called Timaeus, which he happens to be holding in the School of Athens painting, and which is, in some sense, a continuation of the Republic. In this dialogue, a new character, Timaeus, describes the order of the cosmos using the same method, and so he quite literally uses the pattern of the ideal city and the ideal individual as a microcosm, a representation of the order of the cosmos as a whole. And like the creation of a city by people, in his telling, the cosmos was created by a god called the Demiurge, which literally means craftsman. The Demiurge looks to the eternal pattern and then attempts to craft that pattern in matter. The result is not perfect because the eternal model doesn't bind perfectly with matter, and the result is a creation that exists between being and non-being. Instead of an eternal, unchanging cosmos, there are cycles of death and birth, and all of creation is in this state of moving either up toward being or down toward non-being. The more order a society and an individual possess, the more being they have. And so, like Midgard or Middle-earth, the lands between is suspended between being and non-being, or the heavens and the underworld. Something similar to Plato's cosmos was generally accepted for 2 millennia, and, along with the ideas of Aristotle, formed the basis of all scientific and religious thought. But it also led to perhaps the most anxiety-inducing discovery in human history, the heliocentric cosmos. The issue was not just that the sun was put at the center of the solar system instead of Earth, but that the order that had been described was flawed. There was not a divine, eternal order if you looked up to the heavens, and there was not devolving order as you looked down into the earth. The cosmos was simply governed by very different laws than had previously been imagined. And most importantly, the analogy between ourselves, society, and the cosmos was broken. And that leads me back to a sorcery called Fleeting Microcosm. Conjures an image of a microcosm at a foe's feet that pulses with a single wave before disappearing in a burst. The broken and discarded are fully willing to cling to fleeting simulacra. A simulacrum is a representation or imitation of a thing. This could include artificial life like automatons, or silver tears or albinorics, or, like in this case, it could be a representation of the cosmos as a whole. When we get the Fleeting Microcosm spell at the Cathedral of Manus Meter, and below we find Meter, the Mother of Fingers, it becomes clear that there is no central authority guiding this order, but that it's instead being guided by broken and abandoned individuals. And so Meter, we find out, tries to communicate with the greater will through a microcosm, but that microcosm has shattered, so to speak, leaving her broken and abandoned. The Staff of the Great Beyond reads, "Staff fashioned from the tail fingers of Meter, the Mother of Fingers, and the microcosm raised aloft over the crux they form. The Mother received signs from the greater will from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come." And so it's only through the death of one's world that rebirth into a new world is possible. It's only through the failure of a pattern that a new pattern can be discovered. And it's only through the ability to face failure again and again that we can grow and adapt and flourish in an ever-changing and chaotic world. A world in which no greater will is guiding us, only the experience of learning from our failures. Death and rebirth crops up over and over in this world, far too many times to detail in a video of this length. But in the end, it comes back to each individual player's experience of dying and what it means to them. At the end of the article I previously quoted, the author writes, "Games are composed of fictional challenges, which often seem trite and distant compared with those of daily existence. But Miyazaki's achievement has been to narrow the gap between them. By rooting games in the human experience, in shame, in failure, and even in death, he has brought them closer to life." Elden Ring uses death and rebirth as a microcosmic analogy for success and failure. The success and failures of individuals, but also societies, religions, sciences, and every other aspect of life. Because this cycle is life. Death must come and should be welcomed. The only real failure is the desperate clinging to a life, an order, that has stagnated and petrified. We are microcosms living out the cycle of death and rebirth again and again and again, not in a hopeless downward spiral or with a desire to incinerate all life, but in the pursuit of a perfection that's as ever-changing as the world we live in.